Everyone. My name is Aaron Merchant. I'm the Director of Early Childhood Education Policies and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And I'm thrilled to welcome you back to a new year of the Drumbeat, Conversations on Early Childhood Ed. Joining me today is economist Abby McCloskey, where we'll talk about the future of childcare policy in a divided Congress. I'll turn it over to Abby to introduce herself.
Hi, Aaron. Great to be with you and great to be with all of you. I'm Abby McCloskey. I run a small consulting company here in Dallas, Texas. I'm a mom of 3 kids myself and started researching family policy 15 years ago and never stopped. So these issues are really near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally.
Well, it's great to have you, Abby. Thrilled that you're able to join us today. We're going to talk, obviously, about the new Congress, opportunities for childcare. But I think before we talk about 2023, and if we're being honest, 2024 at this point, I think it would probably be helpful to have kind of a recap of the last 2-ish years and what's gone on in Washington around childcare.
Yeah, that's great because it's really been an action-packed couple of years. And 3 things come to mind that have been happening in our childcare space. The first and probably the biggest for all of our listeners was the pandemic, which rocked the childcare industry and the world of working parents across the country. When schools closed, childcare centers closed, mothers of young children's workforce participation dropped off a cliff because you can't care for your young kids and work at the same time without another care provider. And this really moved the conversation around childcare and its integration into our economy and workforce to the center stage of our public discussion. And it resulted in a historic amount of money, around $50 billion being injected into the childcare industry, some of which is still being spent right now. The second big thing that happened was Build Back Better. And there was a lot of discussion, both when President Biden was campaigning, but ultimately then when he became president and with the previous Congress, around really instating a Democrat vision for reforming universal preschool, childcare, how parents pay for childcare, paid leave. It was a really comprehensive vision for how we would rethink early childhood in this country, but it remained a partisan approach. It never gained any support among Republicans and was ultimately blocked actually by moderates in the Democrat Party. And then when I think about the third thing, it's a combination of these two, kind of an increased attention around addressing these issues with the public, the failure of a purely partisan approach to get through. That when I think of kind of the third big thing that's happened in these last few years, it's been a renewal of conversations around, are there bipartisan reforms we can pass on these policies, because we understand the public appetite for reform is really high. We understand that in a really polarized political environment, kind of one side's vision that doesn't take into account what 50% of the rest of the country wants is not going to work. And so we're seeing kind of a reemergence, I think, of bipartisan working groups and attention for reforms that could actually get through and last and change the landscape for working families and their kids in this country.
So, Abby, it sounds like there is, on both sides of the aisle, an appetite to address this issue, but maybe not a lot of bipartisan support for specific solutions. Would that be a fair assessment?
Probably, but something that does get lost with how polarized things are, when we're turning on the news or Twitter or what have you, is that there actually are areas of long-standing bipartisan agreement on childcare. And the one that comes to mind for me is the Child Care Development Block Grant, CCDBG. It is our largest federal investment for childcare. It's a block grant. It goes out to the states. It's been in existence for 30 years, has always had bipartisan support, in particular because it gives states a lot of flexibility with how they use that money. That money goes to offset the cost of childcare for low-income families in particular. But after that, there's a lot of latitude with how those funds are spent, which works really well in a large, diverse country like ours, where we have red states and blue states and purple states who might decide to administer that program differently. And it didn't get very much attention over the last year, but there has been a lot of concerted bipartisan energy to expand that program, because while it's been in existence for decades, while it creates a lot of flexibility for states, it's been chronically underfunded. So only about 1 of 6 eligible low-income children get a subsidy through that program. And so there's been attention to try to figure out how can we put in more money through this. And actually, it was Republican Senators Burr and Scott who last year put forward a plan to significantly increase the amount of money in CCDBG as an existing bipartisan vehicle for reform. And the omnibus bill, which passed our Democrat Congress, the previous one, but had bipartisan support, also included more money specifically for CCDBG, about a 30% increase, which is a huge win, I think, for those interested in expanding childcare support for low-income working families. And while all numbers in Washington get pretty squishy and hard to understand, the current level now of funding for CCDBG after the omnibus bill is about triple what that program used to be funded at just 5 years ago. So it's a really significant increase, and states will have the opportunity to figure out how to best distribute those resources to the families who need them.
Well, that is good news. And I feel like a political news cycle that sometimes, we have to really look for it. That sounds like some good news in terms of there's an existing program. There are senators and representatives from both parties who can agree that we need to kind of rally around these existing programs, and especially for families that fall in those lower income brackets, provide more assistance. And so it sounds like there is at least forward momentum in terms of figuring out ways to address childcare crises and give states that sort of local control that they definitely need to have. That said, it is a little bit different, these next 2 years than it was the last 2 years, right?
Right.
The Republican Party took over the House, though it's a very slim margin. I think it's 6-7 seats separate the two parties. In the Senate, equally slim, just a couple votes here and there. And then even some of the races, were like 51 to 49%. So by the numbers, it seems like things are very divided. And what can we sort of look at, Abby, in terms of with this new reality moving forward and making sure that the progress that you just mentioned isn't lost?
Right. Well, I think there's certainly hope for increased progress and momentum at the federal level, even with the divided Congress. But I would say it's more probably in the realm of single hits as opposed to home runs, which, as you know, Aaron, is as far as my athletic analogies will ever go. But I could see, for example, reforms around how childcare benefits are taxed. Right now, they could be taxed more like how healthcare benefits or retirement benefits are, and there's some bipartisan energy to change that. Or we could address the existing employer tax credits for setting up childcare facilities, which currently don't do much for small businesses in particular because of their size and other aspects of that credit. So I can see movement at the federal level, but perhaps when we're thinking about big things and big reforms in the childcare and education space, my attention is moving to the states over these next 2 years in particular, because there's been a tremendous amount of innovation happening at the state level in the childcare space. So just to name a few, Colorado has created an entirely new department for early childhood to streamline the bureaucracy where previously programs impacting education and childcare and working families were spread out across multiple departments. Michigan is piloting a program called TriShare, where they're braiding funding for childcare across the state, employers, and parents. Kentucky is piloting something similar. That program launches this July, actually. And so even right there, you see purple, blue, red states all experimenting with different ways to deliver childcare support and reconcile the programs we have in place. And I expect to see even more of that here over these next few years, maybe in particular from red states, especially as maybe some of the governors of red states eye a presidential run in 2024 and want to show their commitment to family policy. There's so much that can be done at the state level, especially with increased funding from CCDBG for how benefits are delivered, for addressing some of the regulatory issues that exist at the local and state level for around like home-based childcare in particular, but streamlining some of those regulatory burdens so more people and different types of care providers can flourish. So really a lot of exciting things happening at the states. And then, of course, with 2024 and the presidential cycle starting in real time right now, that tends to be when big ideas in the policy space kind of rise above the noise and get their time in the sun. And so I would be surprised if there weren't some big ideas for childcare, education, how to support working families that didn't work their way into the platforms for both candidates in the Republican and Democrat Party heading into 2024.
Well, that is reason for optimism, and I think the point is well taken that, when a presidential campaign comes around, a lot of times that can take up all the oxygen, but it can also lead to, as you said, an opportunity for big ideas and to expand on your baseball analogy, big swings at the plate for some real forward progress. So when it comes to these conversations, Abby, a lot of times we like to end on things that chambers or the business community can really take as action items. You mentioned the Michigan Tri-Share program. You mentioned the Kentucky legislation that goes into effect this year. And those two initiatives were passed in no small part due to not just the involvement of, but the leadership of the business community, and really playing a central role in talking to working parents, providers, the business community, policymakers. And so if I was running a state or local chamber and realized that I too would like to really take a more of a leadership role when it comes to addressing childcare challenges at that sort of policy level, what are some first steps that you think that I should take?
Yeah, what a fantastic question, because I think it's always easier to assume someone else or maybe like Washington will handle this really big problem. But the reality is it takes people at the very local level addressing these issues. And, I've talked to a number of folks in various cities who are pulling together stakeholders. So the local chambers and businesses and parents and childcare providers and sometimes the hospital systems and public school systems kind of get all the stakeholders around a table to figure out if there's a better way to address these issues in their community. Talked with a lot of folks who have investigated into the regulatory frameworks that might be keeping different kind of providers from being either in neighborhoods because of zoning rules or in a big office tower downtown because you have to have infants on the first floor. And so all of a sudden, all this empty, vacancies we can't use for childcare, even though there's such a demand for childcare facilities. Just really kind of the nitty gritty, nuts and bolts stuff requires people at the very ground level addressing those challenges within their actual community and businesses. So there's a lot to do. And I do think any effort that tries to address it would be better off if they bring in kind of all the stakeholders in that community together. And then the beautiful thing about living in a place like the US and having laboratories of democracies as states and going down from there to localities is there will be a lot of different solutions that happen in different places that meet the needs of those communities. But ultimately, I think some of those solutions will bubble up to provide a template for the type of reforms that could happen at the federal level.
Excellent advice. What I always try to say to business leaders when they're talking about getting into the admittedly overwhelming and complex topic of childcare is find the experts. There are people who are deep in the weeds on these issues, so find those experts and learn from them, which is what we strive to do on this show. And so I want to thank you so much for your time, Abby. Really appreciate you joining us and kind of walking us through the different ways that in 2023 and 2024 we might be able to continue providing supports for employers, working parents, and of course providers and the kids. So
Thanks,
thank you again.